Yes, so as William said, I'm a researcher at the University of Bath. I'm going to be talking today about autism and access to justice. So to start, I know probably most people in the room have got an idea about what autism is, if not an expert knowledge of it. But just so we're all on the same page, what is autism? And then I'm going to cover some of the research today that's looked at autism and police interviewing. So the majority of empirical research in this area has looked at police interviewing, very, very little on court. But I will discuss that to then move on to implications for court, and then talk a bit about our current project, which is specifically focusing on special measures. So what is autism? It's defined as a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder characterised by difficulties with social communication and social interaction, so understanding other people, communicating with other people, having an implicit understanding of the unwritten rules of communication. And then secondly, restricted and repetitive behaviours and stereotyped interests. So this can include anything from kind of very high sensory sensitivities or under-sensitivity to sensory input through to intense, narrowed interests of a kind of borderline obsessional kind of nature of interests. So we think around 1% of the population are autistic, but there does seem to be overrepresentation of autistic people in the criminal justice system. So studies on sort of prevalence of autism in the criminal justice system are quite patchy. There's real problems in being able to actually measure this, and so different methodologies are used. The sort of general pattern of findings suggests somewhere 7% or higher of autistic criminal justice system people that go through the criminal justice system are autistic, but that can range right up to kind of in the 40% when you look at different cohorts of that. But importantly, autistic people are much more likely to be a victim than a perpetrator of a crime. So that is just overall criminal justice system prevalence. They're much more likely to be victimised or picked up by the police for reasons that aren't actually because they perpetrated an offence. There's other reasons behind that. And it's a hidden disability, so it's not necessarily obvious that somebody's autistic, even on a brief conversation with them. Often autistic people can mask, particularly kind of more intellectually and verbally able individuals, can mask the profound difficulties they are actually experiencing and kind of camouflage that because they're verbally very able. So that's just something to be aware of. So thinking about what autism is, specifically in relation to giving evidence, for example, in a courtroom, I'm just going to kind of highlight some areas of particular difficulty and their relevance for this. So autistic people can experience differences in language and communication. So quite often we see that expressive language is better relatively than their reciprocal language ability. So that is, they are better at speaking than understanding what is being said back to them, if that makes sense. So this can create a real problem because it can be misunderstood that they are understanding everything that's going on when actually it's not necessarily true. And then we've got the kind of back and forth communication aspects, which can be quite problematic as well. We've got social cognition difficulties, so this is understanding other people's minds. What's that person thinking? What's their intent behind that question? What do they really mean when they're asking me that? That's something that's particularly difficult for an autistic person, as is executive function. So this is holding lots of information in one's mind, being able to process very long-winded, complex, multiple-part questions whilst trying to then pull out what they're going to say in relation to that, in response to that, keeping on track with their responses, keeping on track with the whole procedures, filtering out other information. This is all executive functioning stuff, and this is another area of difficulty. Episodic memory, so I've got another slide about this next, but just to say that semantic memory in autism tends to be okay, so this is memory for facts, timeless knowledge about stuff. But episodic memory is an area of difficulty. So this is recalling a past person experience, specific event in time, space, place, context, etc. Which obviously, if you're recounting a criminal offence in court, that's particularly crucial. We also see differences in metacognitive monitoring. So this is when you're reporting something that happened to you in your past, whether you realise it or not, you're making a series of metacognitive decisions and judgments about every single detail that you recall in terms of how accurate is it, should I report at that level of detail, or should I go a bit coarser in my level of detail because I'm not quite sure about that. This is, as I said, a series of kind of implicit decisions that are made in order to help you try and recall information that is accurate and informative at the same time, and this is another area of difficulty. You've then got to pull that all together in a narrative, process and explain the relations among elements of an experience, the sequential order in which things happened, how people and actions were related to one another, and then pull that together in a narrative that attends to a listener's needs from their perspective. So they don't know this, so therefore you have to explain the context around something and how things unfolded. Again, another area of difficulty. And then finally, we've got the environment and the situation. So it's going to be an unfamiliar, stressful, high anxiety-provoking, sensory, sort of having lots of sensory things going on in this situation. So actually, all of these things, even for a neurotypical person, can be really, really stressful. But for an autistic person in particular, they can lead to really, really high levels of stress, which in turn, obviously not being good for the individual, it's also bad for their ability to be able to provide their best evidence. So this is a real problematic process that an individual has to go through when you take into account all of these different areas of difficulty for them. So just a little bit more about memory in autism, given that recalling a past event is kind of the currency of giving evidence. We see difficulties or sometimes differences in recalling past personally experienced episodes in autism. So autistic people tend to recall more general and factual information or item-specific pieces of information, but not necessarily all together. So they might remember aspects of an experience, but pulling it together marked as that kind of whole bound episode of the when, the who, the what, the where, etc., tends not to spontaneously be there as much as it is for non-autistic people. So as such, they can have difficulty in recalling or indicating the source of information. So when a particular detail happened, who told them or who it was with, or the context around that piece of information that's particularly relevant. Crucially though, these difficulties do seem to be related to retrieval, so actually retrieving the event and recounting it, as opposed to encoding the event in the first place. So what we see is when more supportive procedures are used for an individual recounting their past event, such as they're given more prompts for their recall, they're given more cues, they're given recognition tests, these differences between autistic and non-autistic people disappear, at least when we take intellectual ability out of the equation. Like you've got two groups, autistic, non-autistic, matched on intellectual ability. It's the free recall tests that are really, really problematic. So tell me everything that happened. That's where we see the differences between autistic and non-autistic people. So that's a kind of overview of the episodic memory difficulties that we see in autism. As I said, semantic memory tends to be absolutely fine, memory for knowledge, timeless facts, etc. It's this recounting of past personally experienced episodes. So over the last 15 years, I'd say probably, there's been an accumulating body of research that has looked at how these memory differences and difficulties then transpire in an eyewitness police interviewing type scenario. And the overall pattern of findings of this work show again that free recall is problematic. So autistic people give less complete, that is, they recall fewer details. The details that they do recall tend to be less accurate, they're less specific, so, you know, the time, space, place, contextual details that pinpoint it to a particular time, and sometimes less relevant as well to the actual aim of the questioner. So just linking back to what I was saying about kind of theory of mind, social cognition type stuff, if you've given they've been asked a very open, tell me everything that happened, there's no cues there to what the interviewer actually wants to hear. So then you kind of reduce the specificity and relevance. We also know that the cognitive interview, which is a widely used, very evidence-based police interviewing technique for eliciting more details from neurotypical witnesses, isn't helpful for autistic witnesses. So it takes longer to conduct anyway as an interview. It fails to increase the number of correct details that autistic witnesses recall, and it actually reduces their overall accuracy. However, we also know, so this is where translating the sort of basic memory research findings into a more applied work becomes less consistent, is we know closed questions are also not ideal. So in the lab on basic memory research, yes, we find free recalls problematic. You know, you give someone a list of words to learn, you ask them to recall them all. That's harder than when they're given more cues or recognition tests for those words. That's one thing. But actually get somebody to recount a past experienced event and ask them closed questions about it, that's when you start introducing errors and misinformation, and also limits completeness, because your question is focused on a small part of what happened, not like the broader picture. We also know that leading suggestive questions are problematic. So for any witness or individual, just a word here on suggestibility and compliance. So autistic witnesses aren't actually more suggestible than non-autistic witnesses. That is, they're no more likely to change their memory or what they believe to be true on the basis of suggestive questions, and that's a memory issue. So but they are as suggestible as non-autistic witnesses, so we don't want to be asking suggestive questions anyway. But they may be more compliant, and by compliant, that's to go along with a suggestion or request or acquiesce to something. They might not necessarily believe that to be true, but they're doing it for other reasons, to get out of the situation, for example. So leading and suggestive questions obviously want to be avoided with anybody. So that's what doesn't work. Happily, in more recent years, there's now evidence on what does work. So it was quite a while it was just showing this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, but we do now have some evidence on what does work. So having more explicit parameters to questions to improve completeness and specificity. So don't just tell me everything what happened. Tell me what happened yesterday in the shop when you went with your friend between these hours, for example. Cued invitations and non-leading prompts. So this is based on what a witness has already said. So you said you went to the park, tell me more about that. So it's a bit more specific again. There's been a few studies on sketching that have shown that that can be quite helpful as well. So either to just sketch the event and narrate it as they're doing it, or as a tool to kind of mentally reinstate the context that they experienced at the event as a sort of reminiscence type tool, and then they can talk afterwards. And also some adapted techniques such as the witness-aimed first account or WAFA interview, which can be effective in improving accuracy and completeness. So the witness-aimed first account or WAFA, instead of having, and this would be a standard police interview, tell me absolutely everything that happened, don't leave anything out, and the witness goes blur and gives a big account, and then they're asked followed-up open questions based on what they've already said. WAFA instead asks a witness to portion out their recall into segments. So they segment the event up into more manageable chunks. So the interviewer might say in just a few words or a sentence, what was the main thing that happened or the most important thing that happened. You can kind of, tailor that as appropriate. And the witness might say, oh, there was a man that came running up and snatched the lady's bag. And then, okay, thank you, tell me something else that happened. And so they portion it, and it might be like 5 to 7 segments, and the interviewer can, for example, write it on the Post-it note, stick it on the wall. So it's a visual thing, it's been segmented up, you've got the whole event there on the main components of it, and then that can be revisited each of those segments in turn, so they're then asked to give an exhaustive free recall, but within the parameters of those segments. So you're reducing executive functions, you're reducing the burden on social cognition. It's kind of clear what it is they're being asked to recall, and they can kind of park the rest of it in their mind because the segments are up there on the wall and they know they're going to come to that next. And you can kind of move them around as well as needed. So that can be effective in improving completeness and accuracy of recall. We've got further issues, though, obviously, for autistic suspects. So not only have we got all the issues that apply to the witness scenario, but you've also then got aspects around challenging perceptions of deception, etc., etc. So Ralph Bagnall's PhD programme for work, which he's now finished, looked at this very topic. What about autistic suspects? How do they fare in police interviews? So he set up a very cool virtual scenario where participants would go into this virtual world and complete various tasks that would flash up on the screen as a form of a text message. So we had autistic and non-autistic mock suspects. In each condition, they were either given a truth-telling role or a deceptive role. So in the truth-telling role, they just got the series of text messages. They were asked to go and complete various tasks on behalf of a friend who was late for the airport. In the deceptive condition, they were actually had to go into exactly the same environment, but still a laptop. So they're doing the same things, but one's deceptive, one's not. And then they were interviewed about that using a piece-style interview. And we found that truth-telling autistic mock suspects reported fewer extricating details that would support their innocence than non-autistic mock suspects. That is, there was some elements or items of information that would easily show that they were innocent, they didn't do it, but they weren't thinking to actually report them under a peace interview. This is compared to non-autistic witnesses. And both the truth-telling and the deceptive autistic mock suspects were more nervous during the interviews. They found the questions more difficult to answer, and they felt less supported compared to non-autistic witnesses. So this is another study that Ralph's done, where he actually has looked at real-life police interview transcripts. And I think this is just, I just wanted to show this because I think it's quite a nice example of showing how the literal, very literal answering of questions can impact their responses and also their credibility as a suspect or defendant. So the interviewer asks, tell me about these torches, a very open question, quite commonly used, that sort of question, and actually kind of the gold standard, tell me, explain, describe. And the suspect answers, they're for lighting up dark areas. So you can see how that might be perceived as, you know, not in the way it was intended. So we've got these kind of misleading cues to credibility that autistic people will quite often display that are particularly heightened under these sorts of interview scenarios. We've got non-verbal indicators like avoiding eye contact, fidgeting, seeming nervous and having closed body language, all of which autistic people can quite often do, but particularly under this sort of high anxiety-provoking scenario. We've got paraverbal cues, so pauses and hesitation, having an unusual tone of voice, effectiveness or inauthentic speech, and appearing to lack confidence in what they're saying. And verbal cues, such as very literal answers to questions, as we just saw, shorter or less detailed accounts, which we also quite often see, omitting crime-relevant information, and accounts that are inconsistent with the evidence. So all of these things can occur unless a kind of more supportive, tailored approach is taken. Additionally, though, so we do know that these cues to credibility are taken by lay observers. In neurotypical and autistic people, they're taken as indicators of someone not being very credible or lying. But we also know that if an individual is autistic and they disclose that they're autistic, all of these things vastly improve in the eye of the beholder. So they're rated as much more credible if you know that that person is autistic, because that becomes an explanation for those differences and it's not because they're lying. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of a sort of summary of the main evidence today on autism and police interviewing. In court, obviously, we've got a bunch more issues still, so we've got long delay since the event, perceived high status and authority of the whole legal team and everybody in the courtroom, unfamiliar legal procedures and legal jargon, as we sort of touched upon earlier, and in contrast to police interviews, little prohibition on questioning style, so, you know, leading suggestive questions are the norm, along with long-winded multiple-part complex questions, and techniques that they're aimed to undermine the credibility of a witness. And although, I sort of said that very open questions, tell me what happened, can be problematic for an autistic person, so too can be very kind of closed questions or questions that are posed as statements, because they won't necessarily think to correct that, to say that's not wrong, because it wasn't a question, it was a statement. And actually, it's generally used that a counsel won't ask the witness to explain, because this means that they can then get an explanation for the thing that they're being, undermined for. There's very little evidence on autism in the courtroom at the moment. There's a few kind of more like survey type studies in different countries. That which has been conducted to date highlights dissatisfaction by the autistic community who've gone through the court process in terms of a range of different aspects. So their communication needs, their sensory experiences, and the legal representation in the court environment. So crucially, there's quite a disconnect between their reported experiences and legal professionals who've worked with them, who generally say they're quite satisfied with how they've worked with an autistic person. The autistic people are saying they're not satisfied, and they're very, they've various, highlight various areas which have been particularly problematic. They've received few adjustments, particularly for sensory issues as well as communication issues. They generally feel like poor, if any, explanations have been given of what would happen in court, and quite often perceive lack of understanding about autism by legal professionals. They often do not want to disclose their diagnosis to the court, fearing discrimination or unfair stigmatisation. So, thinking about what I just said about actually disclosure can actually really improve other people's perceptions. That's really important as well. But there are significant gaps in our evidence on this to date. So no empirical work has really looked at special measures in terms of the effectiveness and how they are received by autistic people in court. Ranging from screening the witness from the accused through to video recorded cross-examination and use of communication aids and intermediaries. So with that in mind, our current 3-year project, which is about 6 months underway at the moment, is looking at special measures, autism in court, with a particular focus on special measures. And I'm working with a lovely team of Laura Crane, Michelle Mattison and Ralph Bagnall, you can see up there. So this project aims to answer some of the research questions that we don't have the answers to at the moment. So what is the impact of standard courtroom proceedings on an autistic person? We actually don't really know that. There's been some surveys which have sort of got at it, but they're getting a lot of other stuff as well. So actually, what happens when an autistic person goes through court? What are their experiences? How able are they to provide evidence under standard courtroom proceedings and cross-examination? And then with that in mind, secondly, what effect do special measures have? How much do they improve it? What aspects are particularly beneficial? What aspects may be less so? Are further measures needed? What is the effect of special measures or without special measures on the individual's perception, how other people perceive the individual in terms of their credibility? What are the barriers and enablers to effective provision of special measures? And then finally, the implications of this. So we want to really use findings to train and develop guidance and best practice and ways forward. So we don't just want to end there, it's actually what are the next steps now based on these findings. So we've got 3 work packages. The first work package is looking at more qualitatively, looking at lived experiences. So we've got currently surveys, interviews and focus groups with autistic community members who've gone through the criminal justice system, the court system, and also legal professionals who've worked with them. So that's surveying and interviewing them on their experiences. And then we're also going to do a walkthrough in the study after that. So actually setting up a courtroom with a jury, with a judge and counsel, and getting them to recount a past event that we'll also set up, and then reporting on their experiences as they're going through it. And afterwards, half of them are going to receive special measures, half of them aren't. We've then got an experimental stream where we're kind of doing more en masse in numbers to actually look at the effect of cross-examination on the accuracy and completeness, etc., of what they recall. And we'll pick apart some special measures in that and look at the effect of those and look at juror perceptions. And then, as I said, developing training and guidance and evaluation at the end. So we're currently here. So we've done the surveys are out. We are in that phase, but we are desperately needing more respondents, particularly from the kind of legal side. This includes intermediaries, judges, barristers, solicitors, anybody who's worked in a kind of more of a professional capacity. Please, we really, really appreciate your support with this. So you can either take part in an online survey or drop us an email and we can arrange an interview over Teams, whatever you would prefer. We'd really, really appreciate that. Moving on from the stuff that's been done previously, this is focusing much more on the evidence giving, the process of going in, giving evidence, any adaptations that were given, any that weren't, what was helpful, what wasn't, all kind of aspects of that, thoughts on what would be needed going forward. So that's quite important to get this data now so that we can tailor the rest of our work based on these findings. Yep, so just some resources to finish, which I think some of them are in your pack anyway. And thank you very much for listening.
I'm going to tell you what former defendants with mental health conditions and learning disabilities told me about their experiences of going through court